A few weeks ago, we presented a flashback episode from 14 years ago in which Kumar and I discussed issues 21 through 37 of Swamp Thing, the beginning of Alan Moore's run as writer on that book. 7 years later, and in this week's flashback episode, Koom was joined by Darrell Epp, in his only Deconstructing Comics appearance to date, discussing issues 38 to 50, including the artists Moore worked with on Swamp Thing, Moore's new take on werewolves and vampires, the appearance of John Constantine, and what the character of Swamp Thing learned about himself and about good and evil. It's a flashback to Deconstructing Comics 617 from January 30th, 2019. First, I want to thank our patrons for helping to keep the show going. You can pitch in by pledging at least $2 a month at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
This is Koom for Deconstructing Comics, and I'm with
Darrell Epp, the author of the books Sinner's Dance and After Hours, and Friend of Koom.
Okay, and we're discussing Saga of the Swamp Thing, issues 38 to 50. Previously on Deconstructing Comics, they'd discussed the Alan Moore issues going up to issue 37, I believe, which introduces John Constantine and the idea that Swamp Thing can regenerate himself by sending his consciousness into the green and growing a new body. So the issues that we're discussing are the bulk of the John Constantine issues in the Alan Moore run of Swamp Thing, and they feature what was called the American Gothic storyline, where Swamp Thing goes across America on the behest of Constantine, fighting these various outcrops of evil that lead up to a massive showdown between the ancient darkness and the ancient light that culminate with that showdown in issue 50. So where shall we start, Darrell?
Well, I guess we'll start on the last page of the previous issue, where Swamp Thing is basically saying, hey, Rosewood, Rosewood, that word sounds familiar. Where do I know that word from? And it turns out the Alan Moore Swamp Thing is actually vaguely remembering the Marty Pasco Swamp Thing.
Have you read all of those issues?
I've read most of them. And Swamp Thing first went to Rosewood in issue 3. And this is something I have to say, but I'm uncomfortable saying it because I don't like going negative. Stephen Bissette has pointed out that when Marty Pasco was the writer, John Totleben and him and Tom Yates said, hey, I have a great idea, ABC. And Marty Pasco basically said, you're the artist, you do what I tell you. How dare you tell me I'm the writer? There is a hierarchy at DC Comics, and for some reason the DC Comics office always wanted to make a superstar out of the writer, and they always really viewed the artist as interchangeable tools. Like, for example, Sandman, over its 75 issues, really suffered because it couldn't keep a regular artist because all the attention was on Neil Gaiman.
Right.
And the artists were treated so poorly considering what they were contributing.
Yeah.
And there was nothing Neil could do about it, nothing Alan could do about it. There was something in the water. And like I said, the Marty Pasco Swamp Thing comics are not very good because they're overwritten by someone. Sometimes before Alan Moore gave a more literary cachet to comics, there were people in the 70s and early 80s who felt like they were slumming, like they were too good for comics. So they wanted to show what the good writer they were by overwriting, to the point where you'd see panels that were sagging under the weight of the caption box. And you had a lot of writers who I could name work in the 70s who didn't understand that comics are not movies, they're not novels, they're a blend of words and pictures.
Right.
And there are a lot of great comics that have sequences without dialogue, just images. And that's good writing. Just because you have heavy caption boxes full of like purple prose doesn't mean it's good writing. And this is actually kind of wild. The idea of having Swamp Thing have hallucinogenic tubers coming off him was not the idea of Alan Moore. That was the idea of John Totleben. And he offered that idea to Marty Pascoe, and Marty Pascoe said, "Know your place."
Yeah, no, I've maybe read one or two issues of the pre-Alan Moore run, and I definitely haven't read issue 3, which I'm guessing involved the vampires that are now living under the water in issues 38 and 39. And you remember that storyline as being pretty bad, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, there was a time when I think Alan Moore did an interview with George Corey, and he basically compared Swamp Thing to The Fugitive, and it was actually dead on. You know how in The Fugitive, Richard Kimball is...
I know where you're going, yeah.
He's looking for the one-armed man, but he finds the one-armed man, the TV show's over. So you know he's never going to find the one. Just like how Gilligan is never going to get off the island, right?
And like the Hulk, there was something akin to the Hulk too, I remember.
Also, so first off, the problem is Swamp Thing is a human trapped in a bunch of weeds, and if only he could rediscover his humanity. But he's never going to, because in the comic ends. Also, as Alan Moore's run progressed, you know that he found out, partially due to the tutelage of John Constantine and the Parliament of Trees, what he really was and what he could really do. But unfortunately, during the Marty Pascoe run, for a superhero, he was very unsuperheroic, where he was strong, which in the DC universe is like vanilla. It's kind of a wash. And when he wanted to travel, he'd have to hitch a ride on a freight train or hide in the trunk of a car full of watermelons.
Sure. Well, from what I understand, I mean, I read the Bernie Wrightson issues. They were just basically trying to do a horror comic that capitalized on what was kind of fanishly popular at the time. So they just have these sort of like horror episodes, and Arcane is very much in that mold, and Abby is sort of the damsel is sort of in that mold. So what's interesting about the American Gothic storyline is Alan Moore is somewhat hearkening to that stuff, but he's trying to string it together in Alan Moore fashion into this great saga that's got to do with ultimate good and evil. And as he said to Neil Gaiman when he was actually working on these issues, I want to really say something about the Manichaean idea of this opposition between good and evil, because that's in everything from comics to movies to that, North American idea of what makes a story. And he wanted to play with that. And he does. And I guess we should discuss that maybe later on in the podcast, because before we get there, he kind of encounters all of these horror motifs, but in Alan Moore fashion, each one of them is sort of trying to say a commentary about American life. So let's start with the vampires. I'm guessing this vampire story has nothing to do really with the Martin Pascoe stuff, except for the fact that it's located in Rosewood, and this is the result of that previous episode where Swamp Thing had drowned the town.
Oops. Yeah. Again, I don't like to say bad things about anybody, but the Martin Pascoe story was kind of forgettable, and here we just find out that Swamp Thing had moved on from Rosewood, forgotten about it, but now finds out that his heavy-handed approach to fighting evil had resulted in the town being flooded. And throughout the story, we find out that it's called Still Waters, I believe, because the idea is that vampires need blood for the oxygen, and there's something about water that's moving being more oxygenated than still waters. So this underground town, which is cut off from the world and isn't part of a larger system, is a perfect home for vampires to be left alone.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked about this is when Constantine tells Swamp Thing, and I'd forgotten this from the last time I read this, the Swamp Thing gave the vampires an opportunity that they never had in X hundreds of years of existing before. Before, they'd always had to shy away from the sunlight. They'd always have to live like these very isolated existences. But now, because of the drowned town, they could congregate, they could form a town, a settlement, breed, and thus expand. And so Constantine's very much about eradicating that possibility for the vampires to do that, to sort of civilize and to grow their settlement.
Well, actually, what's so interesting about what you just said is that these comics go on a journey across America, but they also go on an internal journey for Swamp Thing, where the big climax of leading up to the important issue 50, and also leading up to the last issue Alan Moore does, 64 there, is Swamp Thing learning about a new way to fight evil. Where previously, like most comic book heroes, his approach had been kind of heavy-handed, and it turns out whenever you try to invade a nation or flood a town or anything great like that, that you will think will strike a blow for the forces of good and righteousness, the law of unintended consequences is always there to make you look like a fool, right? So Constantine basically has to tell him on page 17 here, oh, you didn't really think too much about what your actions would lead to. His use of brute force. Where Swamp Thing says to him, all the creatures infesting Rosewood died in the running water. And John Constantine says, did they really? Is that including the ones in the supermarket? And Swamp Thing slowly says, supermarket? Which is kind of funny, where the comic book is named after him, but here John Constantine is making him look like the chump who's slow to catch up on things. So, This is another piece in the puzzle of Swamp Thing going from being a superhero who trades punches with Batman to becoming an elemental, i.e. a force of nature,
Right.
and moving away from thinking you can fight evil with brute force to ultimately, in issue 50, that huge cosmic handshake.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we get there, and before we discuss Constantine, which I guess is very important, a couple of things I want to point out that I really like about this story. All of these stories made a great impact on me when I read them in high school, and I still feel that impact now. One of the things that's really interesting is the mirroring between the settlement of the vampires in the supermarket, in the drowned supermarket, like you said, and the townspeople who are like living above the water and won't acknowledge the fact that these vampires are there, like a shadow underneath the mirror of the lake. And so there's a mirroring there because these townspeople don't seem very nice. The kids are horrible little kids.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I like is one of the mind-bending things Moore does, besides the actual hallucinogenic stuff you mentioned, is that he shifts perspective. Not just visually, but also like mentally throughout the run. And one of the great moments that just really affected me profoundly is when Swamp Thing goes down into the water, gets destroyed by the spawn of the vampires, and then realizes that he's been thinking too human-like, so he lets his body decay and then taps into the surrounding landscape and really just makes of himself a body of the trees and the vegetation growing on the mountain, and flexes his muscles so that he basically just breaks the dam and just destroys. Yeah, just look at this.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
This
very
moment
beautiful.
There just is so powerful. Just that idea that you could like shift your consciousness from this human scale to this topographical scale just really blew my mind.
To being a mountain, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what's exciting about what you said is that comic book characters are known for never changing. They're very static. And some people find that comforting. Like, the facts of Superman haven't changed for 70 years. Mm-hmm. But here in this issue, you actually see the main character of a comic book learning about himself and learning what he is. Like, just in the previous issue, before the vampire issue, he had finally learned how to...
regrow.
Yeah. And then John Constantine says, complete regeneration in 58 seconds, a new record. And then he went on to learn, it didn't take 58 seconds, it could be instant, he could do anything, right? So one thing that must be said is that Alan Moore obviously has some strengths as a writer. And one of those strengths is that besides writing better scripts than other people, one of his big strengths was always saying to his artistic collaborators, here are my art directions. If you can think of something better, go ahead. And when you're working with someone as, with an interesting imagination as his Swamp Thing collaborators, that's the way to go, right? And understands the tug of war between the writer and artist in comics. Will Eisner said that the relationship between the writer and artist in comics should be very close, so close, ideally, that they share the same body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, Howard Chaykin has said a lot of interesting things about the deleterious effects of Watchmen, how after Watchmen there have been... He's received scripts from people half his age giving him impossible art directions. And Howard Chaykin is like, hey, there's only one Alan Moore in the world and you aren't it, right? And people say, Alan Moore, author of Watchmen, when the idea of having the book's title go vertically down the spine, that wasn't his idea, that was Dave Gibbons.
Oh, sure. No, he's a great collaborator.
Right.
But I think part of that's because when he started out, he intended to be a cartoonist, and he was drawing. He was just incredibly slow. He's not somebody who's like, I'm going to write all this great stuff and have people be my bricklayer. I don't think he really thought like that. Whereas the person in the Chaykin example you're talking about is thinking that. They're like, I'm this great writer, I have these great ideas, and then these people are going to carry it out for me. Whereas Moore really had an artistic gift for understanding the strengths of the people he was working with and really played to those strengths. And then his scripts were like love letters, right? Especially the Swamp Thing one.
Oh, it's wonderful. And he can draw very, very well, that's for sure.
Alan Moore?
Yeah. And one thing that I just think is so charming is that when Rick Veitch took over, and he's like, yeah, actually, I'm more of a science fiction kind of guy. And then Alan Moore's like, great, Swamp Thing in outer space. Why not, right? And again, that's a team player playing to his strengths, right?
Yeah.
And another strength that Alan Moore has from beginning to end is the ability to recontextualize and thereby revivify stale-dated cliches. Like, how many vampire stories have there been in 100 years, right? Or werewolf stories. And the ability to find something fresh to say about a haunted house, right? That's no small, mean feat there, right? And
well, that's where he draws these social connections. So you mentioned the vampire story and the werewolf story. What did you think of the werewolf story where he draws the connection between wolves howling at the moon and the moon cycle connected to women and their periods and the way women were, I guess, pushed at this time in society? What do you think about that? I think that's one of the motifs that maybe polarizes people. It affected me also very profoundly when I read it in high school, but I think some people may take issue with his using this motif. What do you think?
Well, to your last point, I certainly remember in the letters pages and the zines after the issue came out, there were some people who were unhappy with it because Alan Moore had thought he was writing a pro-woman feminist story, and some women said, no, this is not a feminist story because the woman has no agency. Mm-hmm. Because there were some feminists...
And the only outlet for her is death at the end.
Right. So, Alan Alan Moore, trying to be a good male feminist, is like, oh, she's showing all these this woman having these issues, living in a misogynistic society, and kills herself. And there were a lot of feminist readers who didn't like that and said, yeah, you could have done a better job of having the character have more agency.
But how do you feel about the story, having reread it at this point?
Well, again, I'm not a woman, so the feminist complaints about it I have to accept based on their lived experience. When I first read it and when I reread it, I'm more interested in the story mechanics, and in this example, this is a good example of what a genius can do that jobbers can't. A genius isn't just about thinking of something new, but they're about showing you something that has been staring you in the face this whole time and never noticed. Like, oh yeah, werewolves have a monthly cycle, and so do women. And, you know, the Amityville Horror House was built on an Indian burial site, and here he's referring to a tribe of natives who had a policy of ostracizing their women during that time of the month, and now a modern American misogynist subdivision has grown up on that land. Mm-hmm. So again, that was a good way to take a fistful of hackneyed cliches, and just by giving them a twist, making something brand new and fresh.
Except what's different between the Amityville or The Shining is a good example of that, because I think Kubrick did talk about the native stuff as maybe connected to some of the horrors and whatever, is that Moore really kind of hits home his concerns. So the werewolf in this case is an expression of the woman's rage, that inner rage that she has to like clamp down on and has no outlet except to erupt as this werewolf that like kind of crawls out of her skin and ultimately can have no satisfaction except to impale itself on steak knives, silver-plated steak knives in the supermarket. And so it's also that, besides the sympathy, it's also the heavy-handedness that I've heard has been complained about. And yet, that to me is more really caring about the issue more than actually telling a good werewolf story or a good horror story, whatever that is.
Well, it depends, and your mileage, yeah. Also, the attention, the page Koom is pointing at is page 10.
It's 10 in the trade paperback of this particular issue, or it's page 142 in the trade paperback, but it might not have been that way in the comic.
And before this, the version of werewolf transformation in the popular imagination was Lon Chaney Jr. with the stop motion fur being spotted on his face.
And it's usually a male, like an American Werewolf in London, blah, 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 right? I've never seen it be a female before, have you?
Well, actually, I believe this comes from Angela Carter, who Alan Moore was a big fan at the time, who wrote a series of very interesting short stories. Also, this version of the transformation where the werewolf comes out of the mouth and then sheds the skin like a suit, that is from a movie where the name escapes me at the moment. It was called In the Company of Something, I think. But again, that was very fresh, and certainly for Comic Book Nation was very fresh. But in answer to your last question, certainly your mileage might vary. There are some people who find some bits of Alan Moore's stuff too preachy, too didactic.
That's the word, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Especially as he goes along in the end,
people
right?
Throw at him, yeah.
Right? And that argument can be made. But he always thought for him to have enough of a challenge from genre fiction for it to engage him, it had to be subversive and transgressive and play with the genre conventions, which it did from beginning to end. And also, he believed he wanted each of his major projects to examine a dynamic system or a systemic problem in society. Like if I punch you in the face, you can recognize that as violence, but if someone who has rich parents looks down on a poor person and says, why don't you just work harder? That's systemic violence, which is easier to mask, right? So, like in V for Vendetta, he wanted to talk about anarchy, different ways human beings can govern themselves. And in Watchmen, he was interested in the Cold War, nuclear weapons, the mutually assured destruction stalemate of the 1980s, these things. And obviously Swamp Thing was his chance to preach about environmentalism, but also explore environmentalism and what it meant by having a plant elemental. So each of these issues in the American Gothic storyline, it's also your chance to have turn up a bat and say, here's my version of a werewolf story, vampire, ghost, whatever.
Yeah.
But also it's a chance to use it as a way to dissect America. Like, obviously, there's a great story in this book based on the haunted Winchester house, where the widow is haunted by all the people who've been killed by the guns her husband had made. And, of course, that's a way to talk about American gun culture. And even the vampire story is a really interesting way of talking about
slavery and racism. Sorry, you're talking about the vampire story. Sorry, I was thinking of the zombie story.
The zombie story, right. You're totally right. And the vampire story is also, if you look at it, a nice way to talk about, if not immigration or immigrants, but there was an anthropologist named René Girard who wrote a lot about scapegoating and the othering, and about how
I thought of Native people when I
sure, great,
yeah.
But I mean, it's very up the alley of René Girard about how whatever tribe there is, right, humans find safety in a tribe by identifying what we have in common. And what we have in common is pointing our finger outside the tribe at the other.
Sure.
So there was a lot of ways in which the underwater vampires were a cracked mirror of the antiseptic American,
right,
all-American dream suburb.
Right.
But on the other hand, it also gave you a chance to point your finger and say, I'm not that. We're the good guys.
Yeah. Just one thing before we leave the werewolf story that I found really interesting is that after her transformation, she does not kill her husband. She does not kill the person who's made all these, like, who's foremost in the story. I mean, there's other things, like the porn shops and stuff.
Yeah.
The supermarket with its abrasive sense of her role in life. But the husband who makes all these, like, really nasty cracks and is like a little bully, she does not kill him. And at the very end, before she dies, she asks Swamp Thing. I always thought this guy looks like Neil Gaiman, but I don't think it's supposed to. I'm talking about the guy in the porn shop on page 18 when the wolf breaks through the window. Like, she asks him at the end if her husband is okay. You know, and she says, was Roy all right? And Swamp Thing says yes. And she says, good, that's good. You know, like, she still cares about him at the end. And I thought that was really interesting and complex. It's not, you know, an obvious thing. So we mentioned the slavery and racism story on the plantation briefly, but we should also talk about Constantine. What do you make of Constantine? I find him interesting because although Moore said he became a magician and he took that seriously when he turned 40 in the late 80s, I think it would have been the late 80s, yeah, like around 89. He has magic in his stories from the get-go. I've seen magic and, like, odd demon names and stuff in some of the Star Wars stories he wrote, like when he was an unknown. And so then you have Constantine. You mentioned the ideas that Bissette and Totleben were feeding him, like, that came from them. Like, the spur was that they kept on drawing Sting in the background, and then Moore had to develop a character for who this guy was. But the character, to me, is a really interesting one to look at, because I don't know about later iterations of him. I don't really care. But here, he's a real manipulator, and like he says, I'm a nasty piece of business, chief. Ask anybody. And, you know, throughout the storyline, he pulls some shenanigans that have some real dire costs. and he's a really interesting character. Is he a real magician? If so, what is the nature of his magic? What is the nature of his potential and his abilities? Is it all in the manipulations of other people and forces around him? Does he have true capabilities himself? Like, what do you make of Constantine?
Well, Alan Moore did a long interview with Dave Sim in the back of Cerebus, where he sort of answers some of your questions in terms of when he turned 40, his filing cabinet full of odd things had got bursting to the point where he had no choice but to become a magician, where things were just leading him in that direction. And then that led to what I think is the really great stuff, like the Birth Call and Snakes and Ladders, where it led him from using magical people as just a storytelling device to being a way to investigate the nature of consciousness, art, language, all that fun stuff. So Constantine is of a piece of that. But also, if you notice, Constantine provides a very important narrative function, which is he is a way that Alan Moore can dump on you a whole bunch of exposition without you noticing. Because check this out. He takes over Marty Pasco's Swamp Thing and says, this is kind of a dead balloon here. I want him to be a plant elemental, to have a lineage, to have this, that, and the other thing. And if you just say that, that would involve a whole lot of exposition, which would break the spell. But instead, this gentleman appears out of nowhere and says, I need to conscript you into my army against fighting the force of darkness. I'll teach you as we go. Just try to keep up.
You're absolutely right that he's useful as a narrative device. But what do you make of him as a person? And how invested do you think Moore is in him? Do you think he reflects Moore in any way personally? He is an Englishman. That's an obvious choice. Right? Sting is in English.
Yeah. I think he may have been a helpful avatar or a signpost on Alan Moore's journey to embracing magic a bit more wholeheartedly. And I think the first couple of years of the Hellblazer comic, which were done by a friend of Alan Moore's, Jamie Delano, were pretty much right on the money in terms of keeping the same flavor, where there were times in the Hellblazer comic when...
But he was more sympathetic in those issues. He wasn't as much of an outsider. You never really identify with Constantine here or really get a beat on him. He's very much an outsider.
Well, I think that is because even from his first appearance, he knew what was coming leading up to issue 50 with this huge cataclysmic battle going on. So he didn't have time for niceties or for following the rules. So... in fact, later the issue with the...
So you're saying the circumstances, the ends justify the means in terms of Constantine. There is one issue which is told, not totally narrated from Constantine's perspective, but to a great degree. And that's the most sympathetic one. I think it's the one where it's right after the stuff in the cave, and then Constantine recounts what happened.
Yes,
the despair he feels once the bird's flown with the plane.
And from his very first appearance, Swamp Thing is baffled by him, doesn't like him.
Yes, doesn't like him.
Feels manipulated by that. But then finally, at the end, Constantine shows his frustration and says, you don't get it. They want, the darkness wants to invade heaven. Right? So you can kind of cut the guy some slack if the reason he's been so abrupt with his manners in dealing with Swamp Thing is because he was trying to assemble a team to prevent the darkness from conquering heaven. Like, it's pretty high stakes.
No, for sure.
Coming up, Koom and Darrell discuss Moore's Swamp Thing artists, including Stephen Bissette, John Totleben, and Alfredo Acala, and more.
Who's Who, the definitive podcast of the DC Universe.
Spanning from the first issue of Who's Who in 1985 all the way through the loose leaf edition.
Including all the updates, the spin-offs, custom Who's Who pages for forgotten characters, and tons of in-depth character spotlights.
Entries span from the golden age of DC
and into the extreme 1990s.
Covering characters such as Superman by Kurt Swan and John Byrne.
The Justice League by Kevin Maguire.
Batman by Dick Giordano.
The New Titans by Tom Grummett.
Wonder Woman by George Perez.
The Legion of Superheroes by Keith Giffen.
The Flash by Carmine Infantino.
Lobo by Simon Bisley.
The All-Star Squadron by Jerry Ordway.
Firestorm by Al Milgrom.
Aquaman by Chuck Patton.
So many entries talking about Ian Karkull.
The Forever People again, and again, and again.
And hundreds of other characters found in Who's Who, the definitive podcast of the DC Universe.
Available wherever you find podcasts and at fireandwaterpodcast.com.
Nuclear Man, Batman, Hawkman, 2D Man, and Hour Man. Who are all these people, man? They're all part of the DC Who's Who.
The third season of the 1960s Batman TV show is almost universally regarded as the worst of the three for a variety of reasons. It is notable for having far more female villains than the other two seasons, plus a female superhero in the form of Batgirl. But far from being a feminist statement, it seems to bring out the male chauvinism in 1960s culture all the more. On our Patreon show Bat Bits, my brother Paul and I recently talked with novelist Nancy Northcott about two of Batman's cringiest episodes from a feminist point of view, as part of our series discussing the portrayal of women throughout the series. And coming up on the show, we'll be discussing the long-delayed third issue of Batman Meets Godzilla. We'll spend more time on how the recaps at the start of episodes were constructed, dig into more early drafts of Batman scripts, and more. Get access to Bat Bits by supporting our Patreon at $2 a month. At $4 a month, you also get our monthly show Silver Age Batman, where we're looking at many of the wacky Batman stories from the 50s. This month, Paul and I look at the return of Batwoman in The Challenge of Batwoman from Batman 105. Also at the $4 level, you can still access our past series that covered the first 50 issues of Amazing Spider-Man and more. Follow our Patreon for free and get access to the first two episodes of both Bat Bits and Silver Age Batman. Check it out at patreon.com/deconcomics, and thanks for your support.
And some people say, like, the American Gothic storyline doesn't hang together, as well as some of Moore's other sagas, like, say, the Marvel Man saga or V for Vendetta, which was sort of concurrent at the time. But I really like this saga. I mean, I think the problem is when you read something that's affected you so profoundly at a young age, you can't ever shake that profundity because it's become a part of you. And so I have trouble kind of really viewing this objectively. I do think it goes and fits and starts a little bit, and that Crisis crossover is like horrible. That really kind of is like Alan Moore trying his best to shoehorn whatever, directives he's gotten for that into the storyline. But I was just curious, do you think it hangs together as a saga really well?
Well, again, your mileage may vary on this, but in my opinion, this stuff is great, and I think Alan Moore's work on Swamp Thing holds up to the test of rereading very well. I think you can read it over and over, and it still works. And I don't even have a problem with the Crisis crossover. I really don't. And the American Gothic, I think it functions the way good art should, where it is capable to be read in more than one way. Where obviously if a story is just one thing or has one answer, it can't be art, it's propaganda, and art has to have mystery and multiple layers. If you want to read these issues as one-shot stories in which Alan Moore goes through his closet of horror tropes and does his take on them, you'll be very satisfied. But also it does work as Constantine's and Swamp Thing's road movie across America, leading up to a huge cataclysmic payoff.
Yes.
That does work.
Which is very American in one way, even though Alan Moore's trying to subvert that. But what did you think about the slavery plantation story, before we put this particular book aside, are there particular episodes on that road journey, I like that term, that road trip, that you like more than others, that rang true more than...
Well, it's funny. There was an issue in which Alan Moore encountered a serial killer. And,
right.
And, Dr. William Gull is also a serial killer. He just happens to be much more erudite and eloquent and educated than this particular serial killer. And
I have this page.
Yeah. And that comic where Swamp Thing met that serial killer, maybe it wasn't profound or all that stuff, but it was just a well-told story.
Sure.
With a lot of good turns, great scene setups, great payoffs, and I really believe that in this vale of tears, a well-told story is no small thing, and I don't think they're...
So the serial killer episode kind of is the one that really stands out for you the most?
Well, I just like the storytelling mechanics. I think
of that particular...
Yeah. And
so let's flip to it. Give me a number.
Yeah.
I
Give me a number.
This one too.
Yeah.
I love that one. Yeah.
Actually, I'm not sure if this counts as being part of the American Gothic officially, but
this is when he visits Abby. Poor Abby.
Oh yeah.
She's like, stay off the carpet, stay away from the windows.
Yeah, the story where he meets a serial killer is called Boogeyman.
Yeah.
And again, this is the mystery of art, where if you say, what is Citizen Kane about? And I say, it's about a kid who lost his toboggan.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't do it justice. That's not what it's about. It's about the ride. It's about the journey. It's about how well it's done. So here you have a real dream team. You have Alan Moore, Steve Bissette, Ron Randall, and John Totleben doing great art, great page design.
And let's not forget Tatiana Wood, Wally Wood's wife.
Yeah.
Doing the colors.
Yep.
Gorgeous colors.
Doing a great job. And everything here is just so great. There's a bit where John Constantine is out and about, and John Constantine happens to run into Batman.
And an early plant of Mento, who later plays, he's the guy with the helmet.
Yeah.
In the later... And you can already see he's drinking, and anyway, go on.
Yeah, and of course it has beautiful hatching, not cross-hatching, hashing by John Totleben, which he's a master of. And
I noticed that they tried to kind of keep that consistent, so even when Totleben wasn't doing some of the issues, they'd have Alcala do some of that hatching, or Ron Randall doing some of that hatching.
Oh, and the thing is, with hatching, the lines have to be absolutely parallel, otherwise it just looks messy. And
have the right texture and balance.
And it's a skill that we should really salute. It's great.
Yeah, it's great in this issue.
And then of course, the serial killer goes into the woods, which is always a mistake. Never go into the dark woods. Nothing good ever happens in the dark woods. And he slashes out a deform, cuts off the hand, and out of the hand grows tendrils, vines, branches, and a new Swamp Thing, who's rather angry. And it's just a well-told story,
Yeah, it's funny, because to me that one always seemed like a bit of an oddity. Like, it's not a two-pager like some of the other ones, like with the vampire or with the slavery. So the stuff that sticks out to me is not the serial killer bits, but this page where you see that splash of his face blending into the night sky, and the visit to Abby and the little moment between them, which is great, because a lot of times, although Abby's a great character, she doesn't really get a lot of definition in terms of really individuating her, and most of the time the relationship is in full-on love mode. So when you get something where they're sort of at crosses with each other, that I thought that was really great. The Alan Moore serial killer one, unfortunately, I think I read it for the first time after the Gaiman thing with the serial killer convention.
Serial killer convention?
Yeah, and so because Gaiman, I think, stole that from Moore, I could never really read this without thinking of the Gaiman one first. right? Like the yes.
Well, also I have to say again that comics being a visual medium, there's nothing that substitutes for the experience of having your eye be led across the page in that way to control where your eye's being directed, the speed you're turning the pages, and that serial killer story, I think it is a great showcase for Steve Bissette, who I think really had a supernatural gift for page design.
Yeah.
And
all those shards and the way they flew.
Yeah. And he would do these pages where the panels looked like shattered glass. And after Swamp Thing, Alan Moore kind of disowned fancy page layouts and said he wants his camera in the frame to be like a static proscenium arch and shouldn't be flashy. And of course,
why was it Swamp Thing that made him kind of turn away from that? Because I've noticed that in the later stuff.
Well, it's kind of funny.
It's very articulated later on.
You know, sometimes an artist likes to give himself a certain formal restriction just to have that that wall to play off of. Like, for example, in V for Vendetta, which he started way before Swamp Thing, he famously said, "No sound effects and no thought balloons." Just said, those are crutches. If I knock away the crutches, can I still walk without them, right? And I remember interviews where he said that the panel design should not, I think it was because he wanted to do stories that were more meaningful for him, and he thought that he has a message, and he didn't want crazy panel designs like, you know, the Steranko end of the spectrum to be a distraction from the message. And like, for example, V from Hell, which is obviously a more mature quote-unquote work, had that 9-panel grid, you know, which was a formal restriction, but also gave that work a certain rhythm, like and a real sort of melody, bum 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 bum, that you could have fun with. And also, I think maybe it's just because, you know, Alan Moore is restlessly curious, always wants to challenge himself, and doesn't want to repeat himself. So I think on the one end, maybe just said, I did that, I did it well, now it's time for something new. And also, again, that's just something Steve Bissette was a master of. Like,
yeah, and it's one of the things I really love about the Swamp Thing stuff. And some of the other artists did try to kind of emulate that as well, in the rhythms.
And like, that's again why people who love comics, why they love them. It has certain strengths that other storytelling forms don't have.
On this page.
Like you said to me, like you said to me, "Hey Darrell, do you want to read about a story about a serial killer?" I'd say no, thanks. But if you say, "Do you want to read a story about a serial killer drawn by Steve Bissette?" I'm like, absolutely.
Sure.
Because, you know, it isn't just spoiler alert, the serial killer gets his comeuppance at the end. It's about how it's done, and how inventively it's done, and how, although Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1888, and that's a long time ago, if you're smart enough, you can still find something fresh to do with that form. And there's a certain joy in that, you know. Mm-hmm. Like in good art, you get a good story. You also get the thumbprint of the author saying, hey, I'm alive. Look at this. Look at the joy of discovery, the joy of being alive, you know. And of course, here in... So we passed by the issue based on the haunted house. Yeah. Right?
Just because we're running out of time a little bit, and since we're talking about art, I do want to get you to discuss with me your feelings about the various artists. I think I'm with you in that I just love all of this stuff, but I remember when we met early on, you were talking about Alfredo Acala.
Yeah.
So I was paying more attention to Acala as I was rereading these, and I was like, oh my God, his inks are incredible. The textures are, and I really love the issues. Like, I love Bissette and Totleben, absolutely, but I really like the issues with Stan Woke.
Yes.
And inked by Alcala. I think those are just absolutely gorgeous. they're complementary in such a magical way. So, are the Alcala issues your favorite, or?
Well, I think John Totleben is a monster, a master.
Yeah,
and
he's incredible.
And his work on Miracle Man, that's pretty much the top of the mountain for comics ever.
I was lucky enough to meet Totleben once, and he was the nicest, sweetest guy.
Man, that's great.
Although I've also read stories about like when he was young and living with Bissette, and he was like a bit of a hooligan. They'd like shoplift meat from supermarkets because they were really poor and stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's funny, on Swamp Thing, Steve Bissette was famous for having problems meeting the deadlines, where you see these pages and they're so beautiful, and it's kind of a drag to think that some corporate type is saying, I need a page that's this good, basically every day, or else. So these guys were not compensated well for that. And the thing about Alfredo Acala, he was so prolific and able to do so many pages that before he came over from the Philippines, DC assumed that Alfredo Acala was a pseudonym for a whole gang of guys in the Philippines, because they couldn't believe how prolific he was.
How prolific was he? How many pages could he do?
This is a funny story. Joe Orlando went to Philippines on a talent search and found, Alex Nino, Nestor Redondo, and all these people. And then Joe Orlando said, hey, Alfredo Acala, how many comics can you do in a month? And then Alfredo Acala said, I don't know, 10 or 20. And then Joe Orlando said, oh, there must be a language barrier here, right? So
he's saying like he could produce an entire book in a day?
Yeah.
Oh my God, how is that possible?
So then Joe Orlando showed him current DC Comics by Jim Aparo or whoever, said, no, this is what I mean. I need this, right? And then Alfredo Acala looked at it and said, oh, in that case, sorry, 30 or 40? And he was just insanely productive and had a long career doing Conan stuff, right? But he was the guy in DC when a book was running behind schedule, you'd call him and he'd solve your problem. But the Stan Roach issues, which happen to involve forests and all that great stuff, they are so moody and have such a depth to them that are so convincing and persuasive. And, it's funny, like Totleben, he's so wonderful. And Alcala would also have those textures where, comics were a business. Sometimes there'd be inkers where you can tell this guy just either didn't have the chops or didn't care that much, where he's like, I've got a deadline, I'm not getting paid that much. And Alfredo Acala was just fantastic. And of course, like I said before, I think Alan Moore, Rick Veitch, and Alcala is a real dream team of mine. Mm-hmm. It's really beautiful. And I'm not sure I'm up to date on current comics, but just the amount of depth you could get here, and you would ask me my favorite issue. I'm not sure if this qualifies as being part of American Gothic, but the Parliament of Trees issue.
It's part of that storyline. Yeah, I was going to bring that up next. Go on.
That is actually a real highlight of mine.
Me too.
And it's a fill-in art team. It's not Totleben or Bissette, but it's just, it's Stan Roach and Ron Randall. And it's such a great story in terms of great page design. And
once again, that perspective, that where Moore shifts that perspective from the horizon that Swamp Thing's used to so much more. Like the world, the universe is so much more,
Yeah, and it's so funny how certainly people who spend a lot of time in comic book shops or grew up there are used to multi-issue storylines and comics that you follow, and the ending doesn't pay off. And this certainly, leading up to issue 50, certainly does pay off. Here you have Swamp Thing going to the Parliament of Trees for advice. He gets the advice, and John Constantine scoffs and says, I can get better advice from a fortune cookie.
Yeah.
But it turns out when the chips are down in issue 50, that advice is the advice that saves the day.
Yeah.
After brute force has failed.
Yeah, so when they approached the ancient evil or the original evil or the darkness or whatever you want to call it, it turns out to be a giant hand, right? And each of these characters tries to do battle. Dr. Fate, the Spectre, I forget who the other person is. And then they're all kind of thrown out because the evil's trying to learn about itself. Mm-hmm. What is the nature of myself? What is my role in life? Etc. And Swamp Thing is the only one that he takes the advice from the Parliament of Trees, which is, where is evil? In the soil? Is it in all of the wood? You know? Like aphid eats leaf,
right?
Something else devours the aphid, like blends into the soil, etc. And so he carries that message into the heart of the darkness that's coming and discusses his own doubts, his own inability to understand the purpose of life and the nature of good and evil and the things that he's troubled with. And because of that, because he comes without hostility and without kind of pretension and assumption, the darkness lets him go. And it's the last stage before it shakes hands with the light and then forms that yin-yang kind of swirling thing. So what do you make of all of that? Is that really a profound truth? Has Moore done something different? Even in the story itself, they say, what's changed? What's different? And then Cain and Abel discuss this and say, nothing's really changed, but the air feels different. What does that mean? What has Moore done with this saga that he set out to do to confront the Manichaean dichotomy?
Well, before I solve the meaning of life for you,
yes, please do.
See how I'm ratcheting up the suspense there. Again, to talk about storytelling mechanics, what you just said is so exciting because in these comics, Swamp Thing, you know, like the picaresque novel, you know, Barry Lyndon or whatever.
I love Barry Lyndon.
Great, you know, that was kind of like in the prototype of the novel. The guy would go on a journey through space to different places for a purpose. The purpose was
to learn more about the world and himself.
Yeah. And you don't get that a lot in comics. Certainly you didn't then. Like, for example, Batman never learns anything. Never. He's locked in, right?
That's the key to his success. You keep it simple and you keep it safe and the same.
Batman is a rich guy who punches out poor people under cover of darkness and has a cool car and has all these things you'll never have. He's not going to wake up one day and say, oh, maybe I should join the Peace Corps and fight evil that way.
Well, he does a little bit in The Killing Joke, but once again, that's Alan Moore.
So here, with the advice from the Parliament of Trees, it just reminds me of what you said about the curse, where the woman has the power, wants to kill, somehow, even though it's hard for her, she chooses not to. And then, of course, in V for Vendetta, which that book has a lot of problems, but they do have conversations about, no, violence isn't the answer, or maybe just not so much, maybe not so, And then there is this journey towards putting away comic book violence to something else. And again, that works if you wanted to as a critique of the culture at large, about how many of our knee-jerk solutions to fighting evil are comic booky simplistic, whether it's 19 people from Saudi Arabia attack the World Trade Centers, let's invade Iraq, and that won't solve the problem of evil, but it will make us feel better for a while and will unite the tribe.
And gain some people very vast riches and capital in the process, yeah.
So the Parliament of Trees, they have chosen to put down roots. And instead of being active in the world, to be in one place and contemplate and to just be, instead of trying to use their power to force change. And again, that's kind of right on the money in the sense that if you look at history, all the bad guys, they didn't think they were bad guys. They thought they were the good guys who had good reasons. So, certainly thanks to technology and social media, our current culture is even more knee-jerk, politicized than it was back then. And it's easy to find people who are sure that I'm right, and if you don't agree with me, you're morally suspect, you're part of the problem. And the Parliament of Trees says, no, you're further ahead just contemplating and being still.
But yet at the same time, that inaction in the face of the cataclysm that's coming seems to be derided, not just by Constantine, but there's something about the feeling of the issue itself. Instead of being this like great arrival place for Swamp Thing, it becomes something that leaves him kind of empty, and the reader as well. The issue that does do that is 64, which you mentioned before.
Yes. Issue 64 it's kind of funny. It's Alan Moore's swan song to Swamp Thing, and also his swan song to DC, and that whole American comics world, in which he kind of says, yeah, this whole thing of solving problems with your fists, I'm putting that to bed. And there's a very good question, and the question is, if someone has as much power as Swamp Thing does, which is basically as much power as Superman does, to stop time, to destroy a mountain, then why did you let this tragedy X happen? Why didn't you just fix everything?
Right.
And it's quite the good question. And the answer that Alan Moore leaves in 64 is that, yeah, even if I could, that really wouldn't make you as happy as you would think it would. It's kind of like in theology, there's the problem of theodicity, which is, if God is all powerful and all good, why do bad things happen? And it's certainly one of the oldest questions in town. But
it's maybe the oldest question, if you ask.
Sure.
Me.
So,
in terms of wrestling with your soul, anyway.
Yeah. So at the very least, if we can't solve that huge question, the way this question is dealt with does, I think we can glean a bit from it about Alan Moore's views on it and his views on America, and that maybe, brute force has had its time, and every time the good guys have used brute force to fight evil, the law of unintended consequences was there to go, oops, like World War I, before it was called World War I, was called
the Great War.
The War to End All Wars.
And the War to End All Wars, yeah.
But the War to End All Wars gave birth to World War II. Oops, and so it goes, So when you say Swamp Thing and Constantine were kind of let down by the Parliament of Trees, they were hoping for more, that's culture shock, right?
It could be, or it could be, I don't know. I think that question is unanswerable. Like, why is there evil in the world? Why do bad things happen? I think, like, no matter how much you rationalize the world, even if you have the most rigid worldview of good and evil, and, like, say you're Christian, you're going to go to heaven if you do X, Y, and Z, it still doesn't really account for why the world is the way it is and why it continues to puzzle us, surprise us, destroy us, etc. I think ultimately all you can do is you can come to terms with it and your place in it. You can't really come to an answer. And so by issue 64, that's what Swamp Thing comes to. He comes to some understanding of himself and the world, and he kind of does what Candide does. He, waters his own garden, or keeps his own garden, and that's an unintended pun, but it works for Swamp Thing, with him and Abby just retiring to the swamp, retiring from the world. She doesn't work anymore. He doesn't go out adventuring, and then of course when Veitch takes it over, then he does other stuff. But you can't really answer that question of why is there evil in the world, because ultimately it's a question that's born from our perspective as being consciousnesses, living in the world and dealing with our own set of problems, as opposed to being a tree or a sun or whatever, right? And so all you can ultimately do is come to some kind of peace with that. And the Parliament of Trees have come to their own piece where they've absconded from the world, and they don't even really talk anymore except for that one tree. He has to like go deep into their root consciousness to even be able to thought talk with them. But you did say you were going to talk about we didn't even get to talk about the Brujeria, which I love. Now, I never finished Bruce Chatwin's book. I intended to, and I began it, but I never finished it. But I love what he does with those witches, the Invunche and the Brujeria. But you were going to talk about the meaning of life. You said that we would get to what that ultimate resolution was in this saga and how you feel about it and whether you think it... I mean, what I've sensed in our discussion is you see a very anti-violence, not anti-violence, but you can't really kind of change the world by acting on it with physical force, as kind of coming out of what you take out from it.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a higher level of sophistication to go from looking at acts of violence, like the Joker punching Batman, to systemic violence, like things like class, like how if you come from a poor family and don't have these certain opportunities, you'll have different outcomes, but all these assumptions are just kind of made invisible. It's funny, like in the American South, they were always thought of as being less intelligent, and then John D. Rockefeller, like 100 years ago, investigated and found out that these people were so poor they didn't have shoes, and they were getting tapeworms on their feet that were sapping their strength, and that's why they had lower test scores. So he bought them shoes so they wouldn't get tapeworms, and their test scores went up. But before that happened, the assumption was, they're just white trash swamp people. Of course they're stupid. Of course they don't go to school. So that's an act of violence where it's not as flashy or as interesting as John McClane jumping off the building with the fire hose. And it's so less glamorous and also sort of more ubiquitous that it becomes actually invisible. So I'm just such a fan of good stories and all the different valuable functions they can do, personally, societally. If Alan Moore wanted to preach a sermon about everything that's wrong with America, that'd be a lead balloon because no one likes being preached at. But if you get a story that allows you to take the stalest of cliches and use that as a way to sort of talk, even on a not quite conscious level, about the assumptions that make a nation or a tribe or a society. That's just good storytelling. And then the decision Alan Moore, Swamp Thing makes in chapter 64 to, instead of being the world's savior, he finds more value in trying to be a good husband. That's a very satisfying ending, From the beginning to the end, it's a great ride, and it's very satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of actually making an effort, you're right. All of these characters who try to actually fight the evil kind of fall flat. And then one thing I always think of is I love the sequence where Constantine assembles these magicians. Once again, we get these magicians from the magician more when he turns 40. But anyway, you got Sargon and Zatanna and Zatara and Baron Winter. And then two of them die. And then one of them, Mento, who's not a magician, is pretty much ready for the loony bin as a result of what Constantine said. He didn't need to do any of that because ultimately the dark and the light were just going to shake hands and then sort of clear the air. And so what do you make of all of that?
Well, what you just said, John Constantine wasn't sure how things would go. He was doing the best with what he had, and he thought, hey, I have this certain skill set. I'll round up the best wizards in town, and we can use our psychic energy to hopefully strengthen the good guy's hand. And I think that's what is his attempt.
I hear you, but what I'm talking about is more building up the stakes. And when you finally get to it, you get this kind of undercutting of all of that, which I really like on the one hand, but on the other hand, I don't know what to make of it afterwards, because that sense at the end of what has changed, what's different. Ultimately, very little has changed. The DC universe rolls along as it always has, good guys punching out bad guys. And even when you get to the next Alan Moore storyline, it's Swamp Thing who's like fighting Batman, who's fighting the authorities because of that social stuff. And then he's sent out to space. Some of the space is not typical, I grant you. But, nothing has really changed. Except there's sort of this like one-off statement about the nature of good and evil. This is a very Buddhist thing, like one can't exist without the other, yin-yang.
Well, the funny thing is, it depends on what you think of as being the end of the world and what you think revelation means. For example, what you just said, look at Promethea. In Promethea, they say, oh, guess what? The world's going to end. And then the world ends, and after the world ends, everything goes on the way it did, except everything has a bit of a different flavor and a new sort of intensity, and the individuals in the world have a bit more knowledge about who they are and what it means to be alive, right?
Yeah, that's a very Alan Moore thing, for sure.
It kind of reminds me of The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, where it's a book where people take a bus ride to heaven, and some people like it and some people don't. And some people say, it's not for me, I want to get back on the bus. And then some people get off the bus and walk around, and they say, wow, I've never seen anything this green before. The green is just so much greener here, and the grass is just so much grassier, and everything has this heightened sense of reality to it that takes some acclimatizing and getting used to, right? So the ending is kind of like Promethea territory, where Alan Moore is saying, the revelation is there for you if you want it, right? And if you want to turn away from it and go back to cops and robbers, action, reaction, Batman versus Joker, you can. That'll be too bad, but it's your choice, kind of. So I think in terms of end of the world scenarios, it's actually pretty satisfying.
Yeah, I hear you. I guess I don't know. I don't find it a letdown because, once again, it affected me so profoundly when I was young. And, of course, to me, this issue 50 matches on with that Swamp Thing annual where he goes down into the underworld to get Abby. And I always loved that. That was just such a mind-blowing issue for me. And this is more of the same in terms of exploring the afterlife, the underworld, the hinterlands of existence, what have you.
But let's just be grateful for all the many different layers on which it does work. If you were a precocious 13-year-old boy and wanted to get good value for your 75 cents, you'd be very happy. It's a great story. But also, like I said, it also does say something about our culture, the human heart, how we think of good and evil, how we think of fighting it. So yeah, there's a lot to get out of it. Sure, it's great.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on, unless there's anything else you want to say.
Well, I'm sure we could ramble on for longer, but thanks for listening.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Darrell.
Swamp Thing is published by DC. Follow us on Blue Sky at Decon Comics. Join our Facebook page or the more active group. Listen to our audio-only videos on YouTube. All of those are linked from deconstructingcomics.com, as is our voicemail. You can communicate with us via social media or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. And of course, we'd love it if you shared episodes with your friends and left us a review in Apple Podcasts or other podcast outlets. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. The Deconstructing Comics theme circa 2019 is from bensound.com. The music backing the promotion of our Patreon is Change by Jazar. Next week, it's a new episode. Emmett and I continue our look at Jack Kirby's 1970s work on Black Panther with issues 3 and 4. Till next week, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.